Nikki was born in prison while her own mother was doing time for drug possession. Nikki was raised by her own grandmother, who had a tough time keeping her on the straight and narrow. At only 17 years old, Nikki ended up pregnant with twins, naming the girls Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah, Whitehead, known as Taz and Jazz. For 12 years, they all lived with Nikki's grandmother, the girl's great-grandmother. But Nikki dreamed of giving her daughters a better life. So Nikki and the twins moved about 20 miles away to Conyers, Georgia. The young mom made sure that her girls had the advantages that she didn't have, putting them in dance classes and music classes. Yeah, that sounds like a dope mom. The girls were straight A students with hopes of one day going to Harvard. Can you imagine? Now, the girls were getting a little bit older, so Nikki was losing control and the girls resented their own mother. Nikki, on this one night, had called 911 when she discovered that Jazz had snuck out in the middle of the night to go see her own boyfriend. Her mom didn't know about it. That one night, there was a huge blowout and the police showed up. The twins told the officer that they didn't want to live with their mom anymore. The officer said that they seemed sweet, but she had a bad feeling. After talking with Nikki, who looked scared, the officer realized that she was fearful of her own kids and that they were working together. They were in cahoots. So the officer felt that things had calmed down, but also had a gut feeling when she left that something would probably happen. So she stayed close by for a bit. Sure enough, Officer Scruggs hears screaming from the house 3 to 4 minutes later. Both girls had jumped on Nikki and started beating her up. Nikki manages to get away and calls 911 again. Officer Scruggs heads back to the house and Nikki runs out of the house with a cordless phone, crying, screaming, absolutely terrified. Nikki told the officer that they had started attacking her from the moment that she left. Now the twins, however, said that once they went back in the house after the police left, that their mother became abusive with them, told them that they were not going anywhere and that she started to beat on them. Now that sounds like a common case of she said, she said. Officer Scruggs said based on the physical evidence, Nikki was clearly the victim. Nikki had scratches on her neck, scratches on her chest, and she was hysterical. You could have been two strangers and there would have been more emotion shown. They are arrested and charged for the altercation, and the judge orders them all to go to counseling. So fast forward to that fateful night. Taz and Jazz, at the ages of 16, had flagged down a police car and told them that they came home from school that day to find that their mother had been fatally wounded. Police said that the girls were so distraught by their mother's death and the crime scene. At first they suspected the twins' father, but he had been living in Canada at the time of the altercation, so obviously it couldn't have been him. The twins had told the police that Nikki's boyfriend had caught Nikki on the phone with another boyfriend. So could it have been him? But police started to suspect something though when there had been no force of entry, which basically means one of two things. Either one, the person that did it, they probably lived there, or they could have been invited in. Now, with them being invited in, it could be the current boyfriend, but he had a good alibi, so it probably wasn't him. So Connors Police Captain Jackie Dunn said, one of the twins that we observed in the back of the ambulance, we saw her bite her own arm. This is what Dunn said. And he even said, we stopped her and asked her, hey, what are you doing? And she explained that she does that when she gets upset. Who does that? Who bites their own arm when they're upset? Detective Ken Swift said that these two girls were hugging each other in each other's arms, and when I said, what can I do to make this easier for you? They turned and looked at me and said, can we watch CSI? Who wants to watch CSI after witnessing something like that? I mean, that's just bonkers. That's craziness. Essentially, it was right then that it was like, okay, there's something very, very off about this. So the police also found out that the girls had a history of violence with their mother, and handwritten letters by the girls how they actually wanted their mom gone. Police find clumps of hair ripped out of Nikki's head And then they also found Nikki's DNA from the crime scene all over her boots. The girls also had told the police that they walked to school that day, but there was a gas station and they had a camera and it showed that they didn't walk at all. They actually just hitched a ride from a stranger. So the police were catching them in the lies. And here's the thing, guys. Nikki left behind one crucial piece of evidence. This is the thing that just cracks the case. Nikki left behind a bite mark on her daughter's arm. Remember that bite mark that I told you about? The one where the daughter was biting herself on the way to the hospital? After examination, they matched up that bite mark to Nikki's. It turns out that Nikki bit one of her daughters in self-defense during the altercation. And then on the way to the hospital, one of Nikki's daughters was biting her arm just to try to cover it up. Now that bite mark proved that it linked the girls to the crime. So the girls also had injuries on their bodies that seemed to be the result of the struggle. And when asked about the marks, the girls claimed that they had gotten into a fight with each other. The police decided to separate the girls to see if the stories would remain consistent. And as further proof to their potential involvement in this crime, their stories weren't consistent with each other's or the initial story that they told police. So the twins finally confessed to taking out their own mother. They said that they had been provoked and they normally had fights with their own mother. However, this one goes on for far too long. They didn't want to go to school and got in a heated argument with Nikki. But then the mom, Nikki, hits Jazz with a pot. And then Jazz takes the pot from her own mom. And so Nikki then grabs a steak knife. Oh boy. There was name calling and cursing and scratching, but then it all led up to them fatally wounding her to the point where there was no coming back. They wounded her up to 80 times. Like, that is insane. 80 times. Not 60, not 70, 80 times. They then went to school so they could have a solid alibi. Detectives then found a journal in their home with a premeditated plan to take out their own mother. The mess then led through the home and even outside, suggesting Nikki managed to get away before the twins dragged their own mother back into the house to finish off the rest of the job. She made it to the neighbors. She rang the doorbell and screamed for help. But the neighbors heard and was in bed at the time, so he didn't get up to go investigate what was going on. The girls then smashed their mom over the head with a pot, and they inflicted more wounds with that kitchen knife, and they just cut off oxygen with a ribbon from a medal that the girls had won, with probably the mother's help. They put her in the tub to leave her to just pass away in the water. She told her own daughters, "Kill me now or I'll kill you." She went on under a few minutes until she finally passed away. Apparently, when looking further into the family's history, there had been years of violent turmoil. Hold on, let me start the pie. So the girls had been living with their great-grandmother, but then went back to living with their mom the week prior. They had lived with their great-grandmother for 1.5 years after an altercation where they physically assaulted their mom. Friends of Nikki's say they aren't surprised her daughters took her out. They were once honor students and Girl Scouts. As they had gotten older, they got really difficult to handle. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. I mean, what teenager doesn't? With that, their great-grandmother, who was 80 at the time, they could do whatever they wanted. They apparently stole money, and at some point the great-grandmother was like, "I have to get a deadbolt to my room." They say Nikki wanted to fight for those girls and start over with them. So the girls were found guilty. Turns out that they got 40 years in prison. And since then, Jazz actually graduated high school. And her great-grandmother, Nikki's grandmother, is so proud of Jazz for graduating high school and showed up to her graduation. Now, by the way, guys, I want you to know something. Forensic psychologists, they say that only 2% of crimes of this nature are actually where the kids will take out their parents. So I don't want you thinking that this is gonna happen to you, because out of that 2%, only 15% are daughters that take out their own parents, because this is extremely rare. It is quite common when daughters take out their own parents to see wounds in the 70s or even 80s. It's because that they're acting out of rage. So with all of that, I think what makes this case so crazy is that if it wasn't for Nikki's bite mark, the girls might have gotten away with it. So with that, I think the moral of the story is that anyone can be a suspect. Stay watchful, friends. Today I'm going to tell you about a woman named China Arnold, a young mother who one night had a terrible argument with her spouse over the paternity of their newborn. I think it's safe to say that no argument ends well when alcohol is involved, but the way the night played out for China, in my opinion, and hopefully yours too, was the worst possible outcome. China was born in Dayton, Ohio on March 29th, 1980. But by the time this story takes place, China had a bit of a rap sheet. She was arrested for abducting someone in 2000, and in 2002, she was arrested for forgery. But in 2005, China seemed to be turning her life around and was attending community college in Dayton and was hoping to become a counselor. China was a young mother at just 25. In early August of 2005, she had just had her fourth child, a baby girl she had named Paris. China was living in a housing complex with her children and boyfriend, Terrell Talley. Terrell's income came from selling drugs. On the night of August 30th, 2005, Terrell's sister offered to look after the kids so China and Terrell could have a date night. They had just had their baby girl 28 days prior, so alone time was perfect. They grabbed a bottle of and began drinking it in the park. The conversation quickly soured when Terrell began accusing China about having an affair, and he was questioning whether the baby was even biologically his. Terrell also confessed to China that he had recently slept with their neighbor. That's when things got violent. While they were still at the park, Terrell slapped Paris and pushed her to the ground, and she bit his lip. At this time, there were many drinks in, and they were very intoxicated. Terrell decided to remove himself from the situation and left to go to The Spot, an apartment in their housing complex that he sold drugs out of. China went home, and when Terrell's sister left, her anger continued to grow. And with all that information and in an angry, drunk haze, China figured the only way to get Terrell back was to put the baby in the microwave. The microwave? China closed the microwave door, turned the microwave on, and left the baby inside for 2 minutes. That's actually horrific. After taking Paris out of the microwave, China then took Paris and placed her in a tub of water. China put Paris in clean clothes and laid down next to her on the couch and fell asleep. When Terrell arrived home in the early hours of August 30th, he found China asleep on the couch with the baby sleeping on the couch near her feet. Terrell curled up next to China and also fell asleep. When they awoke to get their other kids ready for school, Terrell finally noticed that Paris wasn't sleeping. China and Terrell frantically rushed baby Paris to the Children's Medical Center. When they arrived, the doctors took her temperature and it was 95 degrees. She was not breathing and her blood pressure didn't even register. It was immediately clear that there was nothing that the doctors could do. Dr. William Maitre was the one to examine Paris. He said he immediately saw the baby had visible burns on her face, trunks, and limbs. Paris had been dressed in a clean nightgown, which the doctors had found odd. She had been burned, but there were no burn marks and no leakage. It was like nothing the doctors had ever seen before. When Dr. William Maitre asked China about the burns, she responded with a question. "My baby has been burned?" China's story was that she had gotten home around 2 a.m. She said that she had tried to feed Paris, but she didn't want to eat. Then after she tried to feed her, she gently put Paris down into her bassinet in front of the fan. She said it wasn't until they awoke later that morning that Paris wasn't acting right. China said that she got her kids ready for school and onto the bus, and right after that is when Terrell and her had left for the Children's Medical Center with Paris. China and Terrell were taken from the hospital to the police station to be further questioned. At the police station, China began to contradict the story she had told to the doctors. She told police that she had arrived home between 9:30 and 10 p.m., not 2 a.m. She said she laid down on the couch with Paris on her chest and they fell asleep. She said that Paris started to cry around 2:30 in the morning. When the crying woke China up, she decided to make a bottle to feed her and also change Paris's diaper at that time. They then laid down on the couch with Paris on China's chest. When China awoke later that morning, she saw Terrell sleeping next to her, but didn't see Paris and didn't know where Paris was. She said that she thought that Terrell had possibly taken Paris to her room to sleep in her bassinet. Her and Terrell went in for questioning separately, and when it was Terrell's turn, the story was much different than the one that China told. He said that he didn't get home until 3 or 4 in the morning. He went to sleep on the couch next to China, and when he woke up, he saw Paris face down on the couch, deceased. Authorities requested and were granted a search warrant to China and Terrell's apartment. The detective had been told by the coroner that the burns that Paris sustained were caused by a thermal injury. There were parts of Paris's body that were severely burned, while other parts had no burns at all. The detective was looking for a rectangular object, like a heating pad or cooking tin that maybe could have caused these burns. The microwave wasn't even considered because why would anyone assume something so horrific? The detectives went upstairs and saw the plastic tub that China had bathed Paris in. Neighbors were questioned and they told the detectives about Terrell's sister babysitting. When China was questioned for a third time on the same day, she told the police that that was true, but that she had gotten home between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, and she fell asleep with Paris. She reiterated that they awoke at 2:30 in the morning to feed and change Paris. When police asked about the tub they had found, she said that she had given Paris a bath in the afternoon and forgot to empty it. Detectives knew about the argument that China and Terrell had at the park on their date, but China told them that the fight was regarding her driving. She eventually confessed that the fight they had was about the paternity of Paris. Police then told China that the neighbors had told them that they spotted China on her porch around 4 a.m. China said that that was true. She was on the porch and the reason was that she was waiting for Terrell. This was when things changed again. Her story now was that she had been waiting for Terrell to come home because he had taken Paris with him when he left that night to cool down. The authorities asked China why she had not told this in the previous 2 interviews, and her answer was that she loved Terrell very much and was trying to protect him. The police asked China if Paris was returned with burns on her, and China refused to answer the question. China was arrested for child endangerment, but let go a few days later due to the lack of evidence. The doctors ruled that Paris's death was caused by hypothermia, but the case was classified as a homicide. Fast forward to 2006 when the coroner learned of microwave experiments in a study that had come out. The coroner saw the story of a baby that had been put in a microwave in Virginia, and the burns that that baby had sustained were similar to those that Paris had. In May of 2006, detectives went back to the housing complex. Terrell and China no longer lived there, but the microwave was still there. They took the microwave to be examined, and it was then that they discovered the small amounts of DNA from the top of the inside of the microwave that were a match to Paris. Because of her size and her burn pattern that was consistent with the heating of the microwave, it was determined that the microwave was the cause of death. The coroner also stated that the time of death was between 1 and 3 a.m., which would mean that Terrell wasn't there, and now there was enough evidence to convict China of the crime. In November 2006, China was rearrested for the aggravated murder of Paris and was put in jail to await trial. There were 3 trials that took place between 2006 and 2011 because it wasn't explicitly clear that China was the sole person responsible for Paris's death. However, while China was in jail awaiting her first trial, she became romantically involved with her cellmate. The cellmate later testified that China had confessed to her about the murder. There was also another report saying that China had confessed to Terrell that she had placed Paris in the microwave. In February 2008, shortly after China's first trial began, Terrell told the jury that his son had told him that he was the one that pulled Paris's lifeless body out of the microwave after a neighbor's boy had put her inside. Because of this new information, the judge declared a mistrial. During the second trial, the mother of the child that was said to have placed the baby in the microwave was able to prove that her son was not at the housing complex when Paris died. China was then convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And on September 8th, 2008, she was incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution. But just 2 years later, on November 5th, 2010, the Ohio 2nd District Court of Appeals reversed China's conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct, and stated that the court erred by not allowing material witnesses to testify in her defense. So then there was a third trial. During this trial, China's attorney argued that the evidence pointed out as much to Terrell as it did to her, but that argument failed to convince the jury. On May 13, 2011, the jury found her guilty of aggravated murder. On May 20th, Arnold was again sentenced to life in prison without parole, with both the jury and judge rejecting the death penalty option. China did not agree with this sentence because her attorney stated that they would be appealing the decision. In September of 2013, China's lawyer requested a new trial in the Second District Court of Appeals, claiming that there were multiple errors made in her case. In December of 2013, the Second District Court of Appeals said that the decision was correct and affirmed the conviction. Then an appeal regarding China's life sentence was made, citing constitutional questions about double jeopardy because she was tried more than once for the same crime. Her attorney asked the Ohio Supreme Court to reverse the Second District Court of Appeals decision and to send the case back to court for resentencing. But in May of 2014, the Ohio Supreme Court decided not to take up the appeal. China is still in prison and will remain there without the possibility of a parole.
In paradise, no one expects anything to go wrong. Yet that's exactly what happened when Thai police found the dismembered corpse of Colombian surgeon Edwin Arrieta Arteaga after his lover Daniel Sancho brutally killed him. Koh Phangan is an idyllic destination for anyone to travel to. At least, that's what Edwin Arrieta Arteaga thought when his boyfriend, 29-year-old Daniel Sancho, invited him to come stay in a luxurious villa for a few days. August 3rd, 2023 began like any other day in Koh Phangan. But something was different on that Thursday morning. At 12:30, a garbage collector was doing his rounds at a local landfill when he discovered something strange. He had stumbled upon an unusual fertilizer bag that was full of something soggy and heavy. The collector peered inside the bag to see what it contained, but was horrified when he realized he was staring at human body parts. The bag contained a human pelvis and intestines. He immediately reported it to the police, and law enforcement descended upon the scene. Police determined that the body parts were very large, larger than the average local Thai citizen, so they concluded that the parts must belong to a tourist. Meanwhile, across the island, more and more body parts began to turn up. 14 bags in total were discovered at various locations across the island. Police were unsure if these parts belonged to several different people or just one person. Knowing they had to act swiftly, an investigation began. The landfill where the first bag was discovered was scoured, and police found yet another bag containing human legs and pieces of clothing. Due to the state of decomposition, they deduced that the murder had taken place just 36 hours before. The body parts were sent for forensic testing, and the identity was later revealed to be that of Edwin Arrieta Arteaga. Edwin was a renowned plastic surgeon with over 35,000 followers on his private and public Instagram page. He was also well known in the local and international plastic surgery communities. So just how did he end up strewn across Koh Phangan? In December 2022, Edwin connected with a Spanish man named Daniel Sancho Bronchalo. Sancho was the son of wealthy Spanish actors and was by all accounts a successful culinary artist and YouTuber. Daniel was 20 years Edwin's junior and was handsome and charming. The two began to message back and forth before engaging in a romantic relationship. They would send each other explicit photos and messages, and they grew closer and closer. They grew so close that Edwin sent Daniel large sums of money, a personal credit card, and $10,000 to start his own restaurant. Edwin began to consider a life with Daniel outside of Colombia, perhaps in Spain, where Edwin would open up 2 new clinics. It seemed everything was going according to plan when Daniel invited Edwin to join him in Thailand for an intimate vacation. On August 1st, 2023, Edwin met Daniel at a Thai airport, and the two made their way to a bungalow at an upmarket villa. Days passed after Edwin arrived in Thailand with no word to his family. This was highly unlike him, and they grew concerned. Although his relationship with Daniel was a secret, Edwin had told his sister about him. She reached out to Daniel via Instagram and asked him to report Edwin as a missing person. Daniel was reluctant, but eventually did just that. He made his way down to the police station, but by this point, police had already uncovered the multiple body parts scattered across the island. At the police station, officers noticed that Daniel was covered in scratches and cuts and thought this was strange. They decided to detain Daniel while they conducted an investigation and possible link. Officials and investigators made their way to the bungalow that Daniel had stayed in and found it to be immaculately clean, almost too clean. Nothing seemed amiss, but when investigators examined the drain, they discovered it contained human hair and a meaty substance. Forensic testing confirmed that the substance was human tissue. Daniel was questioned back at the police station and initially denied any involvement in Edwin's disappearance. But after being presented with all the new evidence, his story changed. Daniel claimed that the holiday started well enough and began with a pleasant bike ride. But as the day ended, tensions began to flare, and the pair argued over Edwin's alleged demands for physical affection and sex. Their argument then escalated into a physical fight. Daniel stated that he pushed Edwin into the bathroom and that Edwin fell and hit his head against the sink and was knocked unconscious. Daniel tried to wake Edwin by pouring water over him, but Edwin did not wake up. Daniel then made the baffling decision to fetch a knife and stab Edwin twice in the chest before slitting his throat. After Edwin's murder, Daniel cut Edwin's body up into 14 separate sections before disposing of them around the island. The autopsy revealed that Edwin was in fact still alive when Daniel cut his throat. Receipts revealed that on August 1st, Daniel had gone to rent a kayak but was refused as it was late. After offering staff $1,000 to buy a kayak, they relented, and Daniel paddled out to sea armed with Edwin's suitcase and some of his body parts. After he dumped them in the sea, he went back to shore and returned to the bungalow to sleep. All the while, half of Edwin's body was still in the room with him. The next morning, he dumped the rest of the body parts. On August 3rd, Daniel checked out of the villa and the parts were discovered. Now, police had to search for a motive. They questioned Daniel on the nature of his relationship with Edwin. Daniel denied that the pair had ever had a romantic or sexual relationship and claimed that Edwin had taken him as a sort of hostage and was obsessed with him. Daniel stated, "He deceived me. He made me believe that he wanted to do business with me to put money into the company in which I am a partner. The only thing he wanted was me, for me to be his boyfriend, and every time I tried to get away from him, he would threaten me." Daniel claimed that he had tried multiple times to sever the connection with Edwin, but all his attempts were unsuccessful. According to Thai media, messages from Edwin were found on Daniel's phone that more or less confirmed this story, with messages allegedly from Edwin stating that he would kill or blackmail Daniel. Daniel also claimed his invitation to Thailand was actually so he could formally break off the relationship with Edwin. Daniel also denied being gay and told Edwin that he was actually due to be married to a Spanish woman. This allegedly enraged Edwin. Daniel's confession indicated that the killing was a spontaneous act, but authorities uncovered information that would suggest otherwise. Surveillance footage captured Daniel at a supermarket on the morning he was due to pick up Edwin from the airport. At the supermarket, Daniel purchased a saw, some knives, and some cleaning agents. This all suggested that the murder was premeditated. Thai police confirmed recently that the case has now been closed and Daniel will soon stand trial for the murder. No trial date has been set yet, but final reports are being drawn up to send to the prosecutor's office. Investigators theorize that the motive for Daniel was to eradicate Edwin from his life entirely so that he could get married without Edwin's threats of exposure hanging over his head. Daniel is currently in custody in Thailand, and his family confirmed that they have used their connections and wealth to hire a prominent lawyer to defend Daniel. It is speculated that a crime of this nature could result in the death penalty. Reactions to the news from the international community varied, with some demonizing Daniel for his heinous actions and others downplaying it. As for whether the murder was premeditated, that remains to be seen. But for now, Daniel remains locked up, unable to hurt another soul. In the case of Daniel Sancho and Edwin Arrieta Arteaga, we are confronted with a chilling tale of betrayal, violence, and the unraveling of a relationship that ended in tragedy. This gruesome incident is a warning of the fragility of human emotions and the depths to which some may go when pushed to their limits.
Wowee, humanity. It's scary out there. And on that note, today I'd like to tell you the story of Christian Longo and his family. It's hard to imagine someone deciding to start a family and then one day turn around and just be so okay with ending that same family's life. Christian Longo was born January 23rd, 1974. Christian and his younger brother were both raised as Jehovah's Witnesses. Christian was 18 when he met Mary Jane Irene Baker, a fellow member of a Jehovah's Witness congregation in Ypsilanti. Mary Jane was born and raised in Michigan, and like Christian, had also grown up in the church. When they met, she was almost 7 years older than Christian. The age difference didn't seem to bother either of them because they became an item and married a year later when Christian was 19 and she was 25. Mary Jane worked as a secretary for the University of Michigan School of Dentistry. Christian had a real appetite for spending money that he did not have. Once they were married, they moved into a small apartment in Ypsilanti's historic district. Mary Jane's family believed that Mary Jane was paying most of the bills. Mary Jane's desire to be married and start a family outweighed any negative that surrounded her relationship with Christian. The fact that he was so much younger and didn't have any direction towards a career, while also having a bad spending habit, didn't deter her. And in 1997, their first child, Zachary, was born. Just 14 months later, they welcomed their second child, a daughter that they named Sadie. By now, the apartment they had moved into when they first were married was too small for 4, so Christian and Mary Jane bought a small tract house owned by Mary Jane's stepfather, James Lowery. Mary Jane decided to quit her job to stay home with the babies, and for some reason, Christian quit his job too. Christian told Mary Jane's family that he had a new job working as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, or maybe it was the New York Times. No one was ever clear on where Christian was getting his money, but he seemed to have to travel often. Whatever the story was that he was telling Mary Jane, she believed him, because Jehovah's Witnesses don't lie. Another fun fact. By 1999, Christian and Mary Jane had their last child, Madison, born October 29th. By this time, Christian's financial problems were becoming ever so slightly more apparent. The house payments he was making to Susan and James Lowery, Mary Jane's mother and her husband, started to bounce. By early 2000, Christian was drowning in debt. His first real turn to crime was creating a driver's license and pretending to be a man named Jason Joseph Fortner. He used this ID at a Pontiac dealership in Ohio to take a Pontiac Montana van out for a test drive. The salesman took a photocopy of the license and Jason left for his test drive, only to drive the van all the way back to Michigan. The salesman only realized after the van had gone missing that the ID he'd been given was fake. The van was worth over $33,000. Once Christian was home, he changed the vanity plate, Kid Van, from his old Dodge Durango and put it on the Montana. The plate didn't link to the make and model, which is usually a problem, especially if you get pulled over. Just 2 weeks after Christian stole the van, he incorporated his own business, Final Touch Construction Cleaning. Final Touch soon had contracts with several home construction companies to do last-minute cleanup work in homes that had just been built. But the debt that Christian had racked up was getting worse and worse, while his spending habits were staying the same. Christian's lying and deception continued, and by the spring of 2000, he was in pretty deep. He had begun to have an affair with another woman, a fellow Jehovah's Witness. Mary Jane found out by discovering emails from the two of them. What happened to not lying? I wish I could say this is where the lies stop, but it gets crazier. Christian had obtained a line of credit in his adoptive father, Joseph Longo's name. He ran up a huge balance on it, totaling $100,000. Then he defaulted on a loan from the University of Michigan Credit Union and cashed a bad check there for another $5,900. Next, he hired temp workers for his business, but wasn't paying them. He had somehow obtained possession of 2 construction trailers and a forklift, and then he sold the forklift to a used equipment dealer for $5,000. But the dealer soon learned the forklift was stolen property and sued Christian to get his money back. By June of this same year, Christian had begun forging checks to himself from Wexford Builders, the home building company which was his primary client. Between June 16 and the middle of July, Christian passed 6 fake Wexford checks, totaling $29,868. So he's defrauding people left and right, kind of nonstop at this point. That can't last long, can it? Well, it doesn't. On July 14th, 2000, Christian was attempting to cash another fake check, but this time the teller at the bank knew something was off and had someone call the police. Christian fled the bank before police arrived, but he had left his driver's license behind. Later that day, the police went to his home address and arrested him. Christian quickly pleaded guilty, but said that he had only cashed the fake Wexford checks because they hadn't paid him properly, and he had told them he was gonna have to begin his own efforts to collect. Christian was eventually charged with 4 felonies related to the Wexford checks, which saw him facing up to 14 years in prison. He pleaded guilty to the 4 counts, but was only sentenced to 3 years probation and restitution. No jail time? That was because he had no previous criminal history. He had quickly pleaded guilty, and the fact that he was the sole support of his wife and 3 children. He was required to meet monthly with a probation officer, do community service, and he had to repay the banks at a rate of $905 a month. But on May 21st, 2001, Christian had made plans to leave town. By this point, he had sold their tract house, and Mary Jane and their 3 children moved to Oregon. Moved or fled? I'm thinking it's the latter. The move set off a probation violation, and Christian was now a wanted man. But Christian and his family were able to set up in Oregon without trouble. They were there for a few months before the incident occurred. In November, Mary Jane's cell phone was cut off, and her sisters filed a missing persons report. But it wasn't until December 19th, 2022 when everything horrifically unraveled. The 19th was when the first body was found. Zachary Longo, who was just 4 years old, was discovered first. His body was floating in a marina in Waldport, which is a coastal community south of Newport, Oregon. 3 days later, divers searching nearby found the body of his sister, Sadie, who was just 3 years old. Mary Jane and their 2-year-old daughter, Madison, were found 5 days later on December 27th. Mary Jane had been stuffed nude in suitcases found in the water near a ramp at Embarcadero Marina. Madison was found inside a different suitcase the same day, dropped off on the same dock. An autopsy report revealed that Sadie and Zachary were killed by asphyxiation, while Mary Jane Longo and Madison had been strangled. Christian became the prime suspect. The same day that Mary Jane and Madison Longo were found, it was discovered that Christian had boarded a plane and was on his way to Cancun, Mexico. He had assumed the identity of Mike Finkel, who was a real person and a one-time New York Times journalist who had been fired for inventing a character in a news piece. Christian was able to enjoy his time in Mexico drinking and snorkeling before he was identified by an American tourist, and Mexican officials extradited him back to the United States. During his official trial, Christian's story was that in a fit of rage over his poor financial situation, Mary Jane had actually killed his 2 oldest children, and that he had angrily responded by murdering Mary Jane and his youngest child. In less than 4 hours, the jury returned with a guilty verdict, and Christian Longo was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In 2011, Longo finally admitted to killing his family, and he remains on death row in Oregon to this day. And that is the story of Christian Longo and his family. Oof, that was rough. I know debt can be overwhelming, but what doesn't add up for me is how that would make someone snap so horrifically. Well, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm Brandy. Thanks for watching Killer Bites.
Isn't it interesting how much we've normalized interacting with strangers? Having so much access to people because of different apps has brought up so many different forms of communication. Unfortunately, not everyone you meet this way has good intentions. The story I have for you today is about one young girl who connected with a man who claimed to be someone and was actually entirely a different person. This is the story of the Catfish Killer. Not much is known about Austin Lee Edwards' early life, but as a young adult, one would describe him as troubled. In 2012, Austin struck up a relationship with someone he met online on a website called Omegle that would pair up users at random to have one-on-one chat sessions where they could speak anonymously. Austin and the young girl ended up moving the conversation from Omegle to Skype. This information alone is not troubling. Online dating has started to become very popular around that time, so he began talking to this girl. What was problematic was that even after finding out that she was 12, he kept talking to her. He was 19, she was 12, and they continued talking for years. So he's a predator, and the fact that this conversation lasted years is just downright awful. The texts he would send her were usually of him being sexually aggressive, and if it wasn't, he would talk about being very depressed. In a text conversation in April of 2015, the young girl, who is now 15, told Austin that she couldn't Skype because her mother was present, to which he then responded with, "Kill her," before threatening, "I'm gonna give myself a black eye, okay?" In May of that same year, he wrote, "I'm a pedo." On February 7, 2016 at 10:28 p.m., Austin sent her a message saying, "I cut myself a little bit. Don't be mad. I might have done it out of sadness, but I don't want you to do it, so I'll say it was an accident." Austin was now 21. He had made an attempt to end his life. There was so much more to what happened than what he had texted her. He had been living with his father in Southwest Virginia. After Austin had cut himself, the authorities were called and the first responders arrived to find a large presence of blood inside. His father told authorities that his son had been drinking and dealing with girlfriend problems. Austin didn't want anyone that came into his house near him. He was refusing to let EMTs treat his injury, and he even attempted to escape from his father. Police were eventually able to control the situation, and Austin was taken to Johnson Memorial Hospital, where he had an apparent serious cut to his left hand. And according to the police report, he had said in front of authorities that he would kill his father and try to kill himself the moment he was free from handcuffs. Police noticed that Austin's father had bite marks on both of his arms, but when asked, he declined medical treatment. An emergency custody order was issued due to the suicidal and homicidal statements made. A judge was able to issue a temporary detention order because of substantial likelihood that, as a result of mental illness, Austin will in the near future seriously harm himself or suffer harm because of his lack of capacity to protect himself from harm or provide himself with basic needs. Austin then agreed to voluntary admission to the psychiatric hospital. He was held for a few days. According to documents, Austin had been advised that he was prohibited from purchasing, possessing, or transporting a firearm, and that right can only be restored by a court. Violation of the law, according to Virginia Code, is punishable as a Class 1 misdemeanor. By March of 2016, after years of messaging and several attempts at breaking up with him, the 15-year-old finally decided to block Austin. Unfortunately, he continued to message her on different Facebook accounts, even though she had never shared her real name with him. Years passed with no other instances of Austin talking to underage girls or self-inflicted harm. At least nothing has been reported yet. Austin applied to become a state police officer. In his application, Austin disclosed his 2016 visit to a psychiatric facility, but the agency hiring had failed to search any databases for his mental health history before hiring him as a police officer. At a certain point after Austin had started working as an officer, he began a new online relationship. However, unlike the last girl he had met online, he had called his girlfriend. This new girl and Austin didn't communicate through videos. The last girlfriend had known from the start what Austin looked like and how old he was. This time, in his late 20s, he told this new girl he was 17 years old. She was 15. Austin was able to obtain the teenage girl's personal information by catfishing her. He knew that she lived in Riverside, California. The messaging stopped between the two when Austin began asking the 15-year-old for nude pictures. There is no exact reason why what happened next happened. Police are still trying to investigate the exact motive. After the messaging stopped and just days after Austin had begun working as a deputy at the sheriff's office, he decided to leave his town of residence to drive across the country to Riverside, California. On November 25th, 2022, the day after Thanksgiving, Austin made it to the home of the Winnecks, the home of the young girl who had recently stopped talking to him. He parked in a neighbor's driveway and went inside the home. At around 11:08 in the morning, officers were sent to conduct a welfare check regarding a young female who appeared distressed as she was getting into a red Kia Soul with a man. While officers were responding, calls started coming in regarding a fire just a few houses down from where the welfare check came from. Firefighters worked to put out the fire, but the devastation had already occurred. Austin had taken the lives of Mark Winneck, 69, his wife, Sherry Winneck, 65, and their daughter, Brooke Winneck, 38, the 15-year-old's mother and grandparents. Their bodies were pulled outside where it was determined that they were victims of an apparent homicide, said an officer. The authorities were able to get Austin's license plate and track them down in Needles, located 30 miles northwest of Riverside. Once confronted, a shootout occurred between Austin and sheriff's deputies, and according to the coroner's report, Austin died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. During the shootout, the teen girl remained unharmed. Speaking at a press conference, Michelle Blandon said, Catfishing led to the deaths of the three most important people in my life: my dad, my mom, and my sister. This started as an inappropriate online romance between a predator and a child, she said. This was an adult that traveled across the country to kidnap a 15-year-old girl, my niece, our family member, with the idea to kidnap her and kill and devastate our family. He took an oath to protect, and he failed to do so. The young girl and her sister who survived this will forever be reeling from the loss of their family. And that's the story of the catfish killer. What a terrible tragedy. Unbelievable that he was able to prey on young girls for over a decade. I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think that all of this could have been avoided with the correct background information? Or do you think that because he was so sick, he was always going to cause harm? Like, was this inevitable? Thanks for watching, guys. I'm Mac, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode of Killer Bites.
Welcome to Killer Bites, the true crime show where we sink our teeth into the twisted tales of history's most notorious serial killers. Today we're dishing up a chilling case that will send shivers down your spine: the notorious Green River Killer. Imagine the seemingly serene landscape in Washington state, where the tranquil waters of the Green River hide a bone-chilling secret. Instead of a culinary adventure, this story serves up a sinister spree of violence and terror. I'm Lucy, and let's get into the story. Our killer had a taste for young women, often targeting vulnerable runaways or workers as his main course. Luring them into his vehicle, he left a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. While the body count rose, a dedicated team of detectives worked tirelessly to unravel the mystery, hungry for justice and determined to bring this predator to a bitter end. Our investigation leads us to Gary Ridgway, an unassuming man who blended into the crowd, masking his insatiable appetite for violence. His deeds would etch his name into the annals of infamy as the Green River Killer. Join us as we sink our teeth in the disturbed mind of the Green River Killer, exploring the bone-chilling details of his crimes, the relentless pursuit of truth by law enforcement, and the lingering impact on the communities he terrorized. The year is 1982. The clouds roll through the state of Washington, and everything is quiet except the growing list of missing persons from Highway 99 or the Strip. The Strip was also known as International Boulevard and was frequented by those looking for a bit of adult entertainment in the form of or sex workers. We can't really sugarcoat that one. The Strip was overrun with female and male workers alike. With missing persons on the rise, the police had their suspicions, but no real evidence or direction to go to find any of the women on the list. That is, until one of them reappeared. July 15th of the very same year, 1982, children were playing by the Green River in Washington and noticed something strange in the water. It was a young woman, a teenager. She was strangled and tied down by her own clothes. Most notably, her ripped denim jeans were wrapped around her neck. Her name was Wendy Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway from her foster home who would later be marked as the first victim of the Green River Killer. Over the next few weeks, 4 more bodies would be found on the banks of that very same river. The victims were all within a few feet of each other, so the police assumed that this was the same killer. It would later be confirmed that each of the women were killed in a similar manner, strangulation. This only corroborated the police's assumption and brought the attention from the FBI. This was, in fact, an organized serial killer. August 15th, 1982, 3 more bodies were found. Marcia Chapman, age 31, was found in shallow water, her pinned down by rocks, all except one, her arm, the current whipping it around in the water. She was practically waving for help. Beside her, the body of 17-year-old Cynthia Hines. And in the undergrowth nearby, 16-year-old Opal Mills, bruised arms and legs and blue boxers around her neck. The very next day, August 16th, 1982, a task force was set up to search for the Green River Killer. The King County Sheriff's Department dubbed the task force the Green River Task Force. Despite its creation and immediate action to investigate the murders, the body count continued to rise. More bodies were found along the riverbank and around the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Over the next 2 years, the Green River Killer would claim over 40 more victims. It wouldn't be until April 30th, 1983, almost a year later, that the police would gain traction on the investigation, finding a suspect in the case that seemed to fit. There were many calls, tips, and anonymous messages left with a task force hotline that pointed the police in all kinds of directions, but one seemed to stick out: Gary Ridgway. And wait till you hear this one. In the spring of 1983, a sex worker named Marie Malvar, who was just 18 years old, was with her boyfriend at a pickup spot on the Strip in Washington. She was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a paint-patched pickup with a dark-haired man about 30 to 40 years old. The story goes that the boyfriend tailed her and the man for a while. As the 30 to 40-year-old suspect drove her out to a wooded area, the boyfriend somehow lost them. Worried that something might have happened, the boyfriend drove around the area looking for the truck and eventually spotted it, parked outside Gary's house. They didn't even go inside his house. It was later discovered that Gary, before his talk with the officers that day, hid scratches all over by rubbing battery acid on his wounds and leaning against a fence. He stated that Marie had put up one of the toughest fights of all his victims. And still, even with the scratches, Gary duped the officers into leaving without looking around or further examination. For all intents and purposes, he seemed normal. Gary was, in fact, the Green River Killer. On the outside, he was a mild-mannered, Bible-thumping husband and family man with 3 marriages under his belt. But this was his facade. Beneath the surface lay a monster waiting to strike. Forensic psychologist Dr. Helen Morrison had done a profile on Gary Ridgway during her examination of the videos and interviews with him. Through extensive research, she discovered a very likely cause to his peculiar interests. Delving into his history, Gary comes from your average white American family. He was the middle child of a family of 5, born to Mary and Thomas Ridgway. His father was a bus driver and his mother was a trophy wife. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but it was a different story inside the home. Gary had a bedwetting problem until he was a teenager. And until he was a teenager, his mother had a peculiar way of assisting him? Yeah. You see, this was around the early 60s, and his mother was more inclined to wear revealing clothing, opting out of the long dresses and skirts of the time, and preferring more provocative or revealing clothing. Anyway, whenever her son would wet his bed, she would personally take him to the shower or tub to clean him off with a thorough wipe down. She would scrub his genitals, and in interviews with Gary, he admitted to having had lustful thoughts about his own mother, dreaming and even fantasizing about her during those times. Dr. Morrison believed this was one major factor in the development of the man that he had ended up becoming. Specifically, this would assist in the development of his insatiable lust and ravenous need to be fulfilled at any and all times of the day. A little Freudian, right? But this wasn't the only thing. His father, Thomas Ridgway, was a bus driver for the city and would often complain and chastise the presence of workers in the area around his route. Gary would get a mouthful of the hate and resentment his father held for the women, hearing his words spill out from an early age. He'd even see his father and mother in domestic arguments, screaming matches as they tore through the house, fighting over many different things, one being that she was a married woman dressed provocatively, gallivanting in swimsuits and herself for the men in the neighborhood. To his father, she was similar to the workers on the street. Dr. Morrison would attribute this attitude to the hatred and deep-seated rage Gary had harbored toward sex workers, making it easier for him to see them as objects, things to be used and nothing more. This didn't stop his father, however, from partaking in their services. He would stop off regularly from his route to frequent the entertainers, and there were even times when Gary would be left in the bus while he did so. I mean, talk about traumatizing. This man left his child alone on the bus while he pursued workers. When Gary turned 16, his true colors began to manifest. His curiosity got the better of him, and he had the inkling for the taste of blood. We can only assume why he did it, but Ridgway in high school lured a 6-year-old boy out into the woods and stabbed him with a knife. How? The boy was stabbed through the ribs into the liver, and luckily he survived the attack, but the identity of the culprit was never disclosed, until now. I mean, I have no words. Who does that? How did he get away with something so heinous? Our guess is that he was testing whether or not he could kill someone. Gary would grow up in that same neighborhood and household until his late teens, where he would then get married to his then-girlfriend, Claudia Craig, and join the Navy. He was soon shipped off to Vietnam, where he worked on a supply ship and even saw combat. During his stay in Vietnam, he would frequent the local workers and even contracted gonorrhea. It enraged him, but he kept going back and continued without protection. His first marriage ended up only lasting 2 years, from 1970 to 72. Due to both his and his partner's affairs. And yes, he was married again, twice more, in fact. His second marriage was to a woman named Marcia Loren Brown in 1973. During his marriage, Ridgway had become somewhat of a religious zealot. In other words, he found God. He became a big part of the church, reading from the Bible both at work and at home, crying after spirited sermons, going door to door to preach the word. He would even chastise his wife for not following the strict teachings of the pastor at home. From the outside, he became the ideal Christian, except for one thing. He would still regularly go out to pick up sex workers on the highway. He also tried to get his wife to participate in public in many places deemed inappropriate, the most notable being in the places he would dump the bodies of his victims. Marcia and Gary would later go on to have a son named Matthew Ridgway, born September 1975. He would be Gary's only child in all 3 of his marriages. Gary and Marcia's relationship would continue until Matthew had turned 5 when they decided to get a divorce. Matthew, when interviewed, had actually described his father as the model dad. He would show up for him at sporting events, take him camping, play catch, all things you'd expect from the average father. But on the other end, chilling enough, in Gary's confession, he admitted to bringing his son on one of his trips to murder a young girl. Matthew claimed not to remember or realize anything was up, but seeing as he was less than 4 when it happened, that's understandable. But wow, Gary really didn't have a lid on his inner demons. He was really just unable to separate himself, even for a moment, with his son to get his fix. Every wife he had and several of his ex-girlfriends reported that his appetite was immense and he would demand several times a day. Many psychological evaluations later, and doctors would chalk the source of this up to his relationship with his hyper mother, specifically the bedwetting and genital washing until he was a teen. The marriage of Marcia and Gary ended in 1981. To many of the investigators and psychologists, it seemed that this really hurt Gary. They believed it's the moment he really began to spiral. It's when his killing spree really started to take off with the first confirmed murder in July of 1982, as described earlier. Remember 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. His murder spree continued uninhibited for another 2 years before local law enforcement arrested him in 1982 for soliciting sex workers. He was subsequently released by the police, and he continued murdering runaways and sex workers all the same. I'm sure it was just as frustrating then as it is now to hear that he was let go. An officer even approached Gary, poking the bear by saying he knew he was the one doing it and that he wouldn't let him get away with such a heinous crime. Gary shrugged him off and went on his way, and he wouldn't be caught for another 18 years. Many other officers agreed with that sentiment, specifically Officer Matt Haney. Assigned to the tip line for the Green River Task Force, Matt Haney's job was to follow up on every lead and/or tip received by the tip line, mail or email, and he did just that. And what he found was the most outstanding suspect was none other than Gary Ridgway. In an attempt to get ahead of the police, Gary decided to come to the police's aid in finding the killer. In May of 1984, he went in for a polygraph test conducted by the police. While not admissible in court, the polygraph is enough to provide reasonable suspicion of a criminal to get a warrant and begin a thorough investigation of said person's whereabouts and personal effects. In other words, if they asked Gary if he was the Green River Killer, they could use the test to conduct surveillance, hold him, and get a judge to sign a warrant to search his possessions. Unfortunately for the police, the polygraph of Mr. Ridgway proved inconclusive. He passed it, denying that he was the Green River Killer and walking out still a suspect, but no closer to being arrested. The killer walked in and out of the police's hands, and they were unable to do anything. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, with no other leads to go on, the police got advice from a surprising source. Who better to help catch a killer than a killer himself? Ted Bundy stepped forward to assist police in getting into the mind of a killer. For those who don't know, Ted Bundy was one of the most prolific killers in American history, known for his extreme cruelty and the violent natures of his crimes. Similarly to the Green River Killer, his killing spree was directed towards women. Officers didn't initially take him seriously or expect anything from Bundy, but listened anyway and were pleasantly surprised. It's 1986, and at the time, Bundy was already convicted and was awaiting execution on death row when he read about the killings performed by the Green River Killer in the newspaper. It's strange, but he offered to help investigators with the case. So they held discussions with Bundy, who reportedly stated his hypothesis that the killer had likely returned to where he had left his victims to perform acts on the bodies. Disturbing, we know, but it was actually correct. We could chalk it up to Bundy's killer instincts or his intuition, but Ridgway later confirmed it. The story doesn't get any easier either. Gary may have passed the lie detector test, but knew he wasn't in the clear just yet. Ridgway reportedly returned to the dump sites in order to contaminate the scene with DNA evidence in different forms in order to throw authorities off his trail. He would leave things like chewed up gum, hair, wrappers, and half-eaten food at the site in order to incriminate someone other than himself. Then, in 1987, Gary was called in by the police to provide a sample of his saliva in order to get data from the biggest technological advancement in law enforcement since firearms: DNA testing. No, not like what you're thinking of right now. It was the classic DNA testing and mapping. It could basically be used at the time to match a father to a child and hadn't been used for much else. It wasn't until '86 that it was thought to bring in DNA evidence for murders and to assist in solving investigations, and even then, it was similar to guesswork, so people still considered it unreliable. The best the police could do at the time was collect DNA for future matches, and in 1987, Gary complied and submitted his saliva for evidence. This would be his undoing. Sadly, that would be later rather than sooner. It wouldn't be until March 2001 that anything turned up. That's 15 years, 20 in total. Significant advancements in DNA testing and research provided fresh eyes for the case. The Green River Task Force was able to re-examine the little evidence they had collected over the time the Green River Killer was active. Beverly Himmick, a Washington State Patrol Crime Lab forensic scientist, was quoted in the New York Times stating, "It was a last-ditch effort. We didn't have a lot to work with, but we went through a lot of evidence again. With one girl, we were able to find a few clinging to her pubic hair." DNA profiles from 3 victims were compared to Ridgway's sample. All 3 had come back a match to the sample he provided in 1987. Then, on November 30th, 2001, investigators announced the arrest of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. It had been nearly 20 years, and finally, one of the most prolific killers in the United States had been captured. At first, he was charged with murder in connection with 4 victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. Almost all of these were found in 1983, 18 years prior, to forego the death penalty and face only imprisonment. Judith was stunned, defeated, and just plain baffled. The man she loved had raped and killed all of these people. How was she supposed to react and recover from this? Interviews with her show her swimming in guilt and disbelief. It's so easy to fall deeper into despair when she herself, the woman who thought to be closest to him, his wife, couldn't tell. She would recount times when he'd say that he was working late or when he would tell her he was headed to the junkyard to scavenge parts. The look on her face says it all, questions bubbling up. Were those the days he killed someone? Was that a life taken that she missed? There's no way this was easy for her at all. And honestly, you can't blame her. By all accounts, he seemed ordinary. If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't feel intimidated or scared. He seemed like a mild and meek, well-mannered suburban stepdad. I mean, sure, the mustache is a bit of a giveaway, but even his lawyers said that when they met him, he seemed like a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Truly, his lawyers believed what he had claimed happened. He was guilty of buying the company of sex workers, but he had never kidnapped or murdered them, until more DNA evidence came in. After 3 more hits on his DNA and different victims, Gary began to sweat. Within the week, he broke. His lawyer said that one day he came in, they greeted Gary with smiles, and he stated, "Oh, you won't be smiling when we're done." Gary confessed he'd been lying to everyone and manipulating them all. Then he said, "I killed them all." November 5th, 2003, he pleaded guilty to the 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Ridgway admitted to killing most of his victims at his house or in his truck, then taking the bodies elsewhere to be disposed of. The bargain stated that he would not be sentenced to death so long as he cooperated with the Green River Task Force, told the truth about his crimes, and assisted the police department in uncovering the rest of the victims not found.
Guilty.
His actual sentencing was on December 5th that same year. He was given 48 consecutive life sentences. The other stipulation for this was that he would provide information to the authorities on where he hid the bodies of the other victims. A sad fact is that there were so many that for Ridgway he hardly remembered their faces or their names, so it's possible there are victims he hasn't or won't point out. He was quoted saying, "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. Most of the time, I killed them the first time I met them, and do not have a good memory for their faces." It's just sickening. This was on behalf of the families who didn't receive closure or even get to know where their loved ones' bodies were. The police took this opportunity to find them and give these families what little peace they could offer. This was also when the police would truly discover just how heinous Gary Ridgway's crimes were. He used his meek and mousy appearance, as well as the fact that he had a son and family, in order to lull women into a false sense of security. He would show a picture of his son or tell them a bit about his life as a father, provider, family man, and that sex workers would typically be afraid of, so he was easily able to lure them into a false sense of comfort. He would offer to take the women to his house. It was actually his preference. Some would agree, others not so much. The other option was to drive somewhere secluded and get into the canopy over the bed of his truck in order to have there. Once inside his car or in his home, they would have. After they'd finished, he would immediately pounce on her, wrap his forearm around her neck, and pull back on her windpipe. He would promise to let them go if they complied, and obviously that was a lie. In his confession, he stated that the only thing he could think of after with these women was, "I've got to kill her, I've got to kill her, I've got to kill her." From there, he would choke them out until they died from strangulation. His mode of operation after that would be to load the bodies into the back of his truck with the canopy and drive out to a secluded area in the woods. Or if he was already there, he would just take the body out of the truck. When he was with officers showing them the spots he dumped his victims, he pointed out a hill in particular that he said he would take many bodies to and just roll them down. Watching his interview and footage of his interactions with the police after his convictions is a different picture. The lawyers and officers stated they believe he cried for sympathy as an act. He felt no remorse and merely faked his feelings of sorrow, guilt, and his entire apology. Honestly, in the videos with the police after, Gary doesn't seem at all shaken up. He looks eager to point the cops in the right direction and continuously shows that he just didn't care. After confessing and assisting in finding the bodies of his victims, Gary Ridgway is serving out the remainder of his 48 life sentences behind bars at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. Thankfully, many of the families were able to gain a bit of closure and solace in the fact that their loved ones were found and were given the courtesy of peace, even after death. And on that note, my fellow crime enthusiasts, it brings us to the end of our chilling journey into the twisted world of Gary Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer. We've delved into the dark recesses of his heinous crimes, toyed with the ideas of what could have made the man become the monster he did, and heard the haunting stories of his victims and their loved ones. Let us know your thoughts on Gary's reign of terror. Should he have been sentenced to death? Was the ruling enough? Should they have just charged him for the entirety of the 71 murders he admitted to? I'm curious to read your thoughts. My name's Lucy, and this is Killer Bites. For all things true crime, like and subscribe to our channel, Killer Bites.
Welcome back to Killer Bites. Thanks for joining me for another episode of True Crime. Today I'm going to cover American serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, the man responsible for taking the lives of at least 22 people. This is also the story of Crystal Searles, a brave and determined 10-year-old, but I don't want to give away anything just yet. If you're ready to hear more about this case, keep on watching. On June 28, 1964 in Oakland, California, Tommy Lynn Sells and his twin sister Tammy Jean Sells were born. After only a year and a half, Tammy Jean died. The two had become sick with meningitis, but Tommy was the only one to survive. Once Tammy had passed away, Tommy's mother asked her sister Bonnie to take care of him. She was going through a difficult period of grief after losing her daughter and needed time to heal. Bonnie lived in Holcomb, Missouri, and grew very fond of Tommy. She felt like a mother figure to him, and she told Tommy that she had plans of adopting him. She was his main caretaker until he was 5 years old. Once Tommy's mother heard of Bonnie's plans to adopt her son, she felt the urge to take him back home. Shortly after, she brought him back to live with her and his other older siblings. Tommy's early life was chaotic. When he was just 7 years old, he started to use alcohol as a coping mechanism for his unstable home life. At 8 years old, Tommy started spending time with an older man named Willis Clark. According to Tommy, his mother had no issue with Willis taking advantage of and molesting him, even encouraging the abuse. When Tommy was only 10 years old, he stopped going to school. Instead, he spent most of his time partaking in drugs and alcohol, and his life began to take a heavy downward turn. There was an incident a few years later when he was 13 years old where he took off all of his clothes and hopped into his grandmother's bed while she slept. He wanted to achieve some sort of sexual gratification. After Tommy's out-of-control behavior, he was kicked out of the house and banned from ever returning. Shortly after, Tommy's mother and his own siblings up and left town without warning, leaving Tommy homeless and responsible for fending for himself. For the next 20 years, Tommy was essentially on his own. He found ways to support with small gigs here and there, but he never kept a job for very long. He spent most of his adult life until that point hopping from town to town and never stayed in one area longer than he had to. He would jump onto trains or hitch rides with random people who saw him standing on the side of the road. And along the way, he would commit many crimes and was thrown in jail multiple times. Tommy claims to have committed his first murder when he was just 16 years old. After breaking into a home, he witnessed an older man taking advantage of a young boy. He claimed to have pulled out a gun and shot the man on sight. However, this is still unconfirmed. In May of 1981, Tommy met up with the family who abandoned him. He traveled down to Little Rock, Arkansas, but wasn't allowed to stay in the home very long. He took off his clothes and attempted to walk into the shower that his mother was using, again, as a way to find some sick sexual satisfaction. She kicked him out of the house, and again, he was banned from returning. Although he did try to seek treatment, it didn't work, and it wasn't to the level he needed. His behavior became out of control. While working at a carnival in 1985, Tommy met a 28-year-old woman named Ina and her 4-year-old son, Rory. The woman and Tommy hit it off, and after some flirty conversation, she invited him to come and stay at her place for the evening. The two slept together, and according to Tommy, after they were done, she started to snoop through his bag, attempting to steal from him. Tommy snuck into her son's room, grabbed a baseball bat, and beat Ina and her son to death. A few days later, both Ina and Rory's bodies were found, but by the time they were discovered, Tommy was nowhere to be found. He had hopped on a train and fled to another state. In 1987, Tommy drugged and strangled a woman named Stephanie. He proceeded to dump her body into a hot spring located in the desert after encasing her feet in concrete. I mean, that's some That's some mob stuff right there. While in New York, Tommy took the life of a 27-year-old woman named Suzanne. Then, while hitchhiking throughout Illinois, Tommy was picked up by a man named Keith Dardine. Keith invited Tommy back to his house to share dinner with the family, as he could see that Tommy was in need of food and company. As soon as they walked through the door, Tommy pulled out a gun, shooting Keith in the head twice. He then proceeded to castrate him and shot him once more. Peter, Keith's son, saw what happened, and sadly, Tommy took a baseball bat and beat him to death. He turned to Keith's pregnant wife, Elaine, and attacked her, and the beating caused her to go into labor. The child was born prematurely, and Tommy beat the newborn child as well. He then took advantage of Elaine, mutilated her, took advantage of her unalive body, and fled the scene. I apologize if that was graphic. It was really hard to describe, but this man was pure evil. His intention was to kill them because he wanted a thrill. He found pleasure in seeing other people suffer, a truly disgusting individual. In 1990, Tommy was sentenced to 16 months in jail for stealing a car in Wyoming. While there, he received a diagnosis of antisocial, borderline personality disorder, as well as bipolar disorder, psychosis, and major depressive disorder. He was untreated and unmedicated, but spent most of his days drinking or taking drugs to numb his mental and emotional pain. Shortly after his release, he traveled to West Virginia and stood on the street corner with a sign asking for change and food. In 1992, a young 19-year-old woman named Fabienne, out of the kindness of her heart, picked him up and drove him to her house to feed him. He stayed in her car while she ran inside. Of course, Tommy had other ideas on his mind and stormed inside her house. He grabbed a knife, held her hostage, and tried to take advantage of her sexually. Fabienne fought for her life. She grabbed a ceramic decorative duck and repeatedly smashed it into his head. Somehow, she managed to take the knife from Tommy and sliced his kidney, liver, and one of his testicles. Full of rage, Tommy took a stool and beat her over the head. She was left with a major gash on her head, but thankfully survived after surgery. As for Tommy, he landed in the emergency room because of his wounds. He was charged and served 5 years in prison for his crimes. Yet again, another person who just wanted to help. Tommy didn't know how to accept love, much less show it to other people. Surprisingly enough, though, Tommy found love while in prison. He married a woman named Nora Price, and after he was released in 1997, he traveled to Tennessee to live with her. I assume that leading a normal, non-violent life was too boring for Tommy, and he quickly became bored. As soon as the two moved in together, Tommy left and continued traveling. Shortly after leaving his wife Nora, Tommy went back to his life of violent crime. On October 13th, 1997, while traveling through Illinois, he killed a 10-year-old boy named Joel. And Joel's own mother was actually convicted of his murder. He quickly made his way out of Illinois and into Missouri. And just 2 days after killing Joel, Tommy found a 13-year-old girl named Stephanie Mahaney and killed her, close to Springfield. He proceeded to take the lives of 2 other people in the following 2 years. One, a 9-year-old child named Mary Beatrice Perez. The other was a 14-year-old child named Haley McCone, who he also assaulted before murdering her. The final crime of our story today involves 13-year-old Katie Harris, 10-year-old Crystal Searles, and 7-year-old Mark Searles. On New Year's Eve night, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, Crystal and Mark showed up at Katie Harris's house for a sleepover. Crystal and Mark's parents were traveling through Kansas, and instead of staying at the house alone, they thought a sleepover would be fun and safe. That night, Mark was told to sleep in the room with a single bed, while Crystal and Katie shared a room with a bunk bed. Mark was furious. She felt like the annoying younger sibling left out of all the fun New Year's Eve celebrations. After the hype died down, everyone went to sleep. Just then, at around 3:50 a.m., Crystal woke up in the top bunk to the sound of a scream. She saw a man with long, dark, scruffy hair and a long, bushy beard standing at the end of her bed. Tommy Lynn Sells had broken into Katie Harris's home, walked into her room, and began attacking her. While she did fight back, she was overpowered by the grown man and his knife, and she was stabbed over 16 times. Tommy hadn't realized that Crystal was sleeping in the top bunk. Just as he went to turn off the lights, he turned around and saw 10-year-old Crystal staring back at him. He rushed over to the top bunk and slit her throat. He proceeded to turn off the lights and close the door behind him. Crystal climbed down to Katie, who was gasping for air. Crystal tried to speak, but she couldn't due to her throat injury. And she believed that the man had gone after everyone in the house and she needed to get help immediately. It was truly a life or death situation. Crystal, hands around her throat, walked over a quarter mile to the closest house. She banged on the door, unable to speak, but could write notes. The police made it to the house, and Crystal continued to speak to them through her notepad, begging them to hurry and save the Harris family. Sadly, Katie didn't survive because her wounds were too severe. They rushed her to the hospital, and despite having a sliced trachea, Crystal survived. Over a few days, she managed to work with the police and sketch artists. And within days, Tommy had been arrested and charged for his murder of Katie and attempted murder of Crystal. During the trial, Crystal took the stand and testified against Tommy. Can you believe a child as young as she was brave enough to face him again? He was found guilty and sentenced to death. This is where he confessed to many of the other crimes he committed, explaining that he had harmed over 70 people. In April of 2014, Tommy died by lethal injection in Texas. The Harris family, the Perez family, and Crystal Searles all attended. That is the end of our story. And what did you all think of this one? I can't believe that it took so long to finally put this man behind bars, but because of Crystal's fight to stay alive and her bravery to testify against him, he finally lost. Thank you all so much for watching this episode, and if you want to watch some more, feel free to check out the Killer Bites page. Until next time, see you later.
Most killers like to think they can outwit the law, but one was not prepared for the detectives they were up against. When Lee Rodart was interrogated, he fell for the trap so expertly set. In August 2017, 28-year-old Lee Rodart killed his co-worker and former girlfriend Savannah Gold by strangling her and breaking her neck. After her death, he disposed of her body by burning it and dumping it in a West Side pond. Rodart was a typical killer by all accounts, arrogant, believing he was somehow above the law, but detectives saw through his lies. On August 2nd, 2017, Savannah's father and brother received bizarre text messages from her phone saying she was running away and quitting her job. The messages sounded unlike Savannah's and were filled with spelling errors. At first, police were at a loss until they received surveillance footage of Savannah from the Bonefish Grill, her place of work. In the footage, Savannah was seen in the parking lot, speaking to someone in a silver car. She then got into the passenger seat, and after a few moments, the car began to violently shake. The door opened and shut 3 times before driving away minutes later. Savannah never got back out alive. Employees were questioned, especially one in particular, Lee Rodart, who said he hadn't seen Savannah that day. But his car was described as the same as the one in the surveillance footage, and police had their first lead. Lee was taken into custody and told it was for an outstanding traffic warrant. At the start of the interrogation, a detective told Lee that he'd be right back, implying that Lee wouldn't have to wait long to find out why he was there. B. Lee was made to wait for a full 90 minutes. This was a clever tactic utilized by detectives because as time passed, Lee's anxiety began to skyrocket as he contemplated how he would handle whatever situation was coming his way. However, he was confident this incident was unrelated to Savannah, unaware that detectives had already seen the surveillance footage. After the 90 minutes was up, 2 detectives entered the room, Detective Reeves and Detective Sally. But these weren't the same ones that initially brought him in. Detective Reeves had actually interviewed Lee 3 days prior regarding Savannah's disappearance. Now, Lee knows something is up. He tried to maintain his composure with a plan to use misdirection during the interrogation. As Detective Reeves began to question Lee about how he knew Savannah, his demeanor was casual, leaning back into his chair as if it wasn't a particularly urgent matter. Lee followed suit, leaning back and stretching his legs out at ease. Detective Reeves then asked a simple question. How long had Lee known Savannah? Lee began telling him that he'd known Savannah for as long as she'd worked at the Bonefish and that the two had briefly dated. He went into details about their relationship, providing a generally long-winded answer. Generally, innocent people give short, concise answers, but those under pressure to maintain a certain image often elaborate to signal false confidence. In Lee's lengthy answer, he detailed how Savannah allegedly started excessively using and that he stepped back from the relationship. He then mentioned that a month before her disappearance, they started hanging out again. What should have been a short answer turned into a 5-minute explanation. Detectives were now even more suspicious that Lee was hiding something, and so they decided to catch him out in a lie. In his first interview, Lee had told Detective Reeves that he hadn't seen Savannah the day she vanished. So detectives asked him again when he had last seen Savannah. Lee immediately admitted that he didn't tell Reeves the truth in the first interview at the Bonefish Grill. He changed his story and told detectives that he did see her that day. He alleged that Savannah had been telling work friends about their romantic interludes, and he met with her in the parking lot to confront her. At this point in the interrogation, Lee still had no idea that the police had the footage, and he thought his story was foolproof. Detectives needed a full confession to get a conviction, but this would prove to be difficult. Lee described that the two spoke, and she asked to sit in the car as she had just done. which seemed unlikely as she was about to head into work to do a shift. He told detectives that he warned Savannah to stop talking about him to other employees, and as a show of threat, he leaped out and punctured one of her tires, and then Savannah left the vehicle. Lee was blending both fiction and fact, trying to paint a convincing picture, but there were inaccuracies as detectives knew she never left the car. Lee continued to dig a deeper hole for himself the more explained, alleging that Savannah began texting someone and walked towards the entrance of the adjacent plaza where she was picked up by someone in an old green Ford pickup truck. Detective Reeves pointed out that it was a remarkably short time in which to text someone and then get picked up, but Lee stuck to his lie. Here, he made a critical mistake, as now detectives knew he was the last person to see Savannah alive. At some point in the interrogation, Detective Reeves asked a pointed question: "What happened to your neck?" Lee had what appeared to be defensive wounds to his neck and arm, which Lee told detectives was self-inflicted. He claimed he used a knife on himself sometime in July, but Detective Sally remarked that the wounds looked fresh and still Lee then alleged that he had simply peeled at the scabs while at work. Both his delivery and his excuses were unconvincing, and detectives were aware he had no previous history of self-harm, making it incredibly unlikely it was self-inflicted. Lee starts to become anxious, which detectives pick up on. He shows jittery movements and gestures and has been shaking his leg repeatedly. Each time he told a lie, his leg would bounce and his hands moved unnaturally. Detectives then decided to exploit this anxiety, hoping to gain a quick confession as the pressure mounted. After asking about the wounds, and in an attempt to amplify Lee's paranoia, they changed tactics and go back to asking about the green pickup truck. Lee explained that the windows were tinted and he saw someone wearing a baseball cap. Detective Sally then asked Lee why he hadn't mentioned it before, and Lee displayed more unnatural hand movements and spread his hand over his thigh, showing visible discomfort. Lee then made another critical mistake, saying he was afraid they'd find out he was the last person to see Savannah. But Detective Reeves catches on to this lie, saying his previous statement just seconds earlier contradicted that. Reeves then decides to push further and directly asks Lee where Savannah is. Despite Lee's claims that he doesn't know where Savannah is, Reeves keeps repeating the question. Detective Sally then tells Lee they have proof he was the last one to see Savannah and that she never got out of the car. Detective Sally had initially been quiet throughout most of the interrogation, but at this point, she dramatically voices her concerns. Reeves, on the other hand, had maintained his deadpan composure throughout, which had set Lee at ease. Now, confronted with an emotive response from Detective Sally, he has no idea how to proceed. Sally starts to beg Lee to tell them what happened, and then Lee breaks. Detective Sally senses this and changes to a more gentle tone, coaxing the information out of him. Lee eventually tells detectives Savannah was upset and tried to stab him, and that he slapped her in response. When Savannah tried to exit the vehicle, he grabbed her round the waist, but then he alleged she calmed down and the pair drove off. But detectives didn't buy this and appealed to his empathy by mentioning how Savannah's family needed closure. Lee, unable to cope with the pressure, became emotional and quietly admitted she wouldn't stop hitting him, so he squeezed her neck. While Lee cried, Detective Reeves gently asked him where Savannah was. Lee spoke in a soft voice and admitted he dumped her in a pond on the west side of the club Dukeley. A dive team was dispatched soon after Lee's confession, and Savannah's burnt corpse was recovered. She was so unrecognizable that her cause of death could not be determined. Lee Rodart was sent to trial and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In March 2021, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. In the battle of wits between a remorseless killer and the relentless detectives determined to expose the truth, justice ultimately prevailed. Lee Rodart's chilling confession tore away the mask of deceit and led to the discovery of Savannah Gold's remains. Today, Lee Rodart remains a classic example that even the most calculating criminals can be unraveled by the relentless pursuit of justice.
Welcome back to Killer Bites, the place where we talk about all things true crime. Today's case takes place in Japan. I'm Brandy. Let's get into the story. Lindsay Hawker was a 22-year-old from England who had just graduated from university with a bachelor's in biology. After graduating, she wanted to do a bit of traveling and explore the world before continuing her path to pursue a higher education. Hawker began to apply to jobs where she could teach the English language in Japan. She got a visa and accepted a job at a school chain called Nova. Nova was a very large and well-known school in Japan, so this job was great. In 2006, she was officially placed in one of the Nova schools located in Tokyo. She found a home to live in with some other foreign roommates. It was a great setup and situation. Hawker was living her best life, teaching, but also exploring the city, taking in the sights, trying delicious food. She posted about her travels on Facebook to update her friends and family back home. It seemed she was having a great time for the first 5 months that she was living there. On March 20th, 2007, she was on a train on her way home. While she's on the train, she sort of notices a man staring at her, and she felt that something was off. She got off the train. The man who had been staring at her got off at the same stop and started following her. He approached her and told her that she was his English teacher, but Hawker was very certain that this man was not one of her students. But this guy was persistent and kept repeating that she was his English teacher. Then he started asking her questions like, "Where are you from? What did you study while you were in school?" Just common questions you'd ask to get to know somebody. Hawker knew that this wasn't one of her students, so she sort of brushed him off and tried to walk away. She got on her bike to ride the rest of the way home. The guy starts running next to her, trying to keep up with her on the bike, and he's still trying to talk to her and ask her questions. Eventually, she makes it back to her apartment. At this time, the guy asks Hawker if he can have some water because obviously he's exhausted from running the whole way there. Hawker, being the nice person that she was, offered him a drink upstairs at the apartment. They go upstairs and he's still asking her questions. He wants to know if she can give him English lessons. At first, she was hesitant about giving these lessons, but eventually she agreed to do it in exchange for 3,500 yen for a lesson sometime during the week. He was delighted she said yes, and then started drawing a picture of her on a napkin. And next to the picture, he wrote down his email address, whitelover@hotmail.com. He wrote his phone number, and he wrote his name, Tatsuya Ichihashi. Hawker wrote on Facebook to her parents about this encounter. She told them, "Love you lots. Don't worry about the guy who chased me home. Just crazy Japan. Miss you, XXX." And that would be the last post that Hawker ever made on Facebook. A few days after this post, it's March 25th. Hawker went to the local coffee shop to meet up with Tatsuya to give him his English lesson at 9 a.m. They begin the English lesson and everything seems to be fine. At the end of the lesson, he confesses that he doesn't have any money on him to pay for this lesson, but he says he has money back at his apartment. He convinces her to accompany him back to his apartment to get the money to pay her. They take a taxi over to his place. She goes up to the apartment, and that was the last time she was seen alive. That night, she didn't return home to her apartment. Her roommates were worried about her and decided to contact the police. Unfortunately, the police didn't take the first call super seriously and they brushed it off. The next day, Hawker was absent from work and still no one had heard from her. People at her work were worried because she had never been late or absent at work. Her work decided to contact Hawker's family and the police on the matter. The family was immediately concerned. The police go to visit Hawker's apartment and they find the napkin with Tatsuya's drawing of Hawker's face and his contact info. The police decide to contact Tatsuya and visit his home, but they couldn't knock on his door without probable cause, and at this time, they didn't have enough information. So the police had to do some investigating on Tatsuya to see if they could find anything that would allow them to enter the home. They found that a few years earlier, Tatsuya got in trouble with the authorities for trying to steal a woman's handbag. So now that Tatsuya had been previously convicted of a crime, they were now allowed to talk to him. They were still not allowed to knock on the door, but they could wait outside for him to come out and then talk to him and question him. At 9:45 p.m., Tatsuya finally exited the home. The police explained that they were there to speak to him about a missing foreign woman. Tatsuya then turned and started running like a bat out of hell. He ran right out of his shoes, but continued in a full sprint in his socks. While he was running away, one of the officers was able to snatch up his backpack, but the police were unable to stop him. Tatsuya got away and ran into the night. The police continued to search for Tatsuya, but were unsuccessful that night. At first, he tried to go to the train station, but spotted the cops outside waiting for him, so instead, he hid out in some bushes. A few of the police officers were later sent up into Tatsuya's apartment to investigate. They found that the apartment was super messy, and throughout this mess and trash, they discovered Hawker's handbag on the floor. They also found that the bathtub had been removed from the bathroom, but it was placed on the outdoor porch. In the tub was a bunch of dirt and sand. Then they looked closer and noticed a human hand coming out of the pile of dirt in the tub. The hand belonged to Lindsay Hawker. Not just her hand, it was her full body buried beneath the dirt. Lindsay Hawker had passed away. With investigating the body, they found that she had been beaten and all of her hair had been cut off. Supposedly, the downstairs neighbors had heard some suspicious noises the night before, but had not reported it to the police. The police found out that Tatsuya had taken many trips to the local gardening store, probably to purchase the dirt and some chemicals to help decompose the body. 2 days after Lindsay Hawker's disappearance, on March 27th, her dad and boyfriend flew out to Japan to identify the body. Tatsuya is still on the run and nobody can seem to locate him, but the police are still searching. The police were offering 10 million Japanese yen to anyone who gave information leading to his arrest. Through the following months, many people had called into the police with tips and sightings of Tatsuya, but nothing substantial. During this time, there were about 8,000 supposed sightings of Tatsuya that poured into the authorities. There were hints that he fled to the Philippines. People claimed to have seen him in nightclubs in downtown Tokyo. All sorts of leads that didn't go anywhere. 2 years went by and still no arrest had been made of Tatsuya. In 2 years, the police had not been able to locate him. So where did Tatsuya go that night after he hid out in the bushes on March 26th? Supposedly, he stole a bike and rode a few miles away, hopped on a train, and went to the outskirts of town. He got off the train and made his way over to a convenience store and purchased a small sewing kit and used it to pierce his nose to change his appearance so that police couldn't identify him. He also used a knife and cut himself. He cut off part of his lips and cut off some of the moles on his face. The police and the family of Lindsay Hawker blasted wanted photos of Tatsuya all around Japan, but now his face would be slightly different and he hoped unrecognizable. He later leaves Tokyo and goes to Okinawa, which is a small town and not part of mainland Japan. So he was far away from the crime scene. No one in Okinawa seemed to recognize him, so he thought he was safe staying there. But he wasn't making much money, so he decided to relocate to Osaka. In Osaka, Tatsuya landed a construction job, which was pretty good and well-paying. With the money from his new job, he went and got plastic surgery to change his face, so he would be even more unrecognizable to the police. He got his nose done, cheek implants, he got eyelid surgery. He looked totally different and nobody knew who he really was. Then one day, Tatsuya decided to go to Nagoya, Japan to get some more plastic surgery. The day after the surgery, the doctor who performed the surgery was looking at wanted pictures of Tatsuya that police had released with his old face on them. The doctor felt something was off and that his patient might be Tatsuya Ichihashi, the guy the police had been searching for. He had mysterious scars on his face that seemed to add up with the wanted pictures, so the doctor contacts the police. Somehow the news found out about the story and put it on blast. Tatsuya saw this in the news and then took off again and tried to leave Osaka and get back to Okinawa. He goes to catch a ferry back to Okinawa, but there wasn't another ferry leaving that night, so he would have to wait until the next day. Someone working at the ferry terminal thought this guy waiting all night and sleeping at the ferry terminal was being sketchy, so he decided to call the police. The police make their way to the ferry terminal and confront the guy. They ask him his name, and he replies that he is Tatsuya Ichihashi. Boom! He confessed and the police finally got him. He was taken back to Tokyo to await trial. The judge of this trial was Messiah Hota, who claimed that he was disgusted by this heinous crime. He's quoted saying he raped her to satisfy his desire, then tried to cover up the rape by killing her. He then attempted to conceal the murder by abandoning her body. The crime was inexcusable and savage. Lindsay Hawker's father addressed the courtroom and told the jury to show no mercy. At the trial, Tasmiyah confessed to the assault and rape of Lindsay Hawker. He said he was trying to keep her quiet, so he strangled her and he didn't mean to actually kill her. He also went on saying that he was sorry and something about how he wishes he could bring her back to life. Tatsuya Ichihashi was convicted of the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He is still in prison today, serving his sentence. While in prison, Tatsuya actually wrote a book about this experience of hiding from the police and being on the run. The book actually went on to be a bestseller. It sold over 100,000 copies. He ended up making a ton of money from this book. He offered the money to the family of Lindsay Hawker as an apology and a peace offering, but the family refused the money. In 2013, a movie was made about Tatsuya Ichihashi. The movie is titled I Am Ichihashi, Journal of a Murderer. But however many books and movies come out about Tatsuya, it doesn't matter. He will continue to sit in prison for life. And that is the story of Lindsay Hawker and her deadly travels to Japan. Thank you for watching Killer Bites. See you next time.
It seems like most of us these days have heard all the stories about the guy in the creepy van. He knows your parents' names, maybe he knows your addresses. He always has candy. But in the late 1970s, some young people of the American Southwest weren't lucky enough to get those warnings. And today I've got their stories for you, the ones that inspired all those creepy videos we had to watch in elementary school. And after this, you'll be glad you did. I'm Jason, and this is Killer Bites. Sacramento in the 1950s was everything the residents there had ever wanted. Great new schools, lots of jobs, new houses, and sunny skies most of the year had young families flocking to brighter horizons from all over the USA. But in 1955, little Gerald Gallego wasn't always enjoying fun in the sun like the rest of his peers. His single mom had had a hard time paying bills and would have gentlemen suitors over each night to help them out. It wasn't the best example for her 9-year-old son. To make things worse, that year, Gerald's father would be the first criminal to get sentenced to a novel method of mortal punishment in Missouri, involving the use of a chemical known as hydrogen cyanide and maybe a bit of carbon monoxide. If it wasn't obvious enough to authorities that this was too much drama for a little boy's plate, they'd be acutely aware that by age 13, little Gerald would have his first run-in with the law after seriously harming a 6-year-old girl. This early beginning would preface a reign of terror that Gerald Gallego carried out for the rest of his life, before finally facing justice. Before then, he'd go through 6 wives by his 24th birthday. In due time, he'd bring another victim along with him on his murder spree, or maybe, as many believe, an accomplice. They'd be an extra macabre 80s Bonnie and Clyde who journeyed across the Southwest, showing people there for the first time that real boogeymen lurk in the broad daylight. Charlene Williams was an adored and doted upon only child. She had a high IQ, many friends and hobbies, and the full support of her socially and financially stable parents in any of her aspirations. Nonetheless, she seemed to lose her way by high school and stopped caring about her education or hobbies, and spent most of her time going out to friends to smoke and drink. After 2 failed marriages of her own, she'd meet, and pretty quickly marry, Gerald Gallego. Within 2 weeks, they'd moved in together. Mary Beth Sowers was a shining light of ambition in Sacramento, where she was well loved by friends, family, and professors alike. The University of California student had a sweetheart named Craig, and they were said to be a big power couple on campus. At least that's what everyone thought before their luck would run out on November 2nd, 1980. Walking home after Craig's fraternity's holiday formal, they'd be spotted for the last time in the back of a strange car his frat brothers had never seen before. It belonged to Gerald and Charlene. Missing the next morning, a concerned friend found Mary's red Honda, the one the couple had taken to get to the formal, still still in the lot with the keys inside of it. And when this friend reported them missing to the police, he was told that Craig had already missed his first class that day, completely out of character for the campus's most responsible power couple. Meanwhile, a witness had seen Charlene's car at the scene the night before, so they found it registered under her and her father's name, Charles Williams. But when they went to check up, her father told them that she'd been out on a date the night before with her husband, Steve, who she didn't live with. But police would be surprised when Charlene and her husband, Steven, pulled up just then in the driveway. Steven ditches right away when he sees the squad car outside, but Charlene goes in anyway and promptly vomits in the kitchen sink. At this point, the police are a bit confused, as I currently am right now. Charles told them that she was pregnant at the time and experiencing morning sickness, but when they asked her the questions directly, she let it slip that they'd taken her boyfriend's car out last night, and the police officer called her bluff right away. After a quick search of that car turned up nothing, she refused to continue answering questions, so the cops went back to study up on Steven. Gerald Gallego had a bit of a thing for guns, wouldn't you know it, and police were able to track down information that indicated he'd been fired from his last bar job for shooting one of those guns spontaneously into the air during a shift. So the bar owner told police that the bullets were still in the ceiling. So when they took a forensic sample, they'd found the evidence they'd needed. The bullets fired from Gerald's weapon were the same ones found earlier that day in Craig's recently discovered corpse. And Steven was none other than wanted man Gerald Gallego, who they now suspected had fled the state with wife Charlene after Charles told them she never came home that night. The chase was on, and few would believe just how far these sinister lovers would go to escape justice and satisfy Gerald's sickest fantasies. Years before, on September 11th, 1978, 17 and 16-year-old Rhonda Scheffler and Kippy Vaught were chilling at the mall like they usually were on the weekend. So when 21-year-old Charlene asked them if they wanted to smoke some pot in her car, well, they didn't think they'd be getting into any trouble, besides the drugs, of course. Charlene was another young woman they thought was kinda cool, but they didn't know that her 30-something husband would be waiting for them too when they left the mall that afternoon. Gerald, well, he didn't want a quick thrill like the innocent girls trying to pass their time. What he wanted was a permanent sex slave. He pulled a gun on Rhonda and Kippy immediately, ordered them to bind themselves and lay down on the mattress arranged inside the van. I mean, what else could they do? Taped and locked inside, he drove them all the way to the empty deserts of Nevada and lived out his fantasies for hours at the cost of their lives. He'd forced them to dig their own graves before walking back to the car alone. He ordered Charlene to drive, and she did, all the while knowing exactly what had happened. She'd agreed to help him commit the crime after years of him describing his sex slave fantasies to her already. Maybe at first she thought it was into some kinky power dynamic thing, or she might be able to satisfy this fantasy herself. So who knows what Charlene was thinking at this point, driving Gerald away from this horrific scene, but it wouldn't be another year before Gerald started talking about his fantasies again. If Charlene had thought that this single horrific act would satisfy her new husband into their happily ever after, she was dead wrong. In 1979, he'd tell her that he was ready for another special outing, and he needed her assistance again. This time, 14-year-old Brenda Judd and 13-year-old Sandra Colley would be waiting for their parents to pick them up from the day of fun they just had at the county fair in Reno, Nevada, when the van would cruise up before them. And they're just as oblivious as the Gallegos' last innocent underage victims. Charlene offered them money to help her put up flyers for her new business, and the helpful girls agreed. But just like before, Charlene would walk them to the van where her husband was waiting for them. This time, Gerald drove while Charlene sat in the back with the girls, stroking their hair and telling them that everything would be okay. They went on for hours, and the only stop they made was to a hardware store where Gerald would purchase a hammer and shovel before they ended up once again in the desert. When Gerald once again came back from the wilderness without the girls, Charlene had the guts to ask him what he'd done, as if, and he was frank with her. They're dead now. Just drive. It would become an annual ritual for this devilish duo. Gerald was satisfied for some months until his fantasies started creeping in again and again. He'd start discussing his fantasies, which were a bit more real than the term gives them credit for at this point, to an incessant degree up until the day their victims would meet their fate. All the while, Charlene presumably hoped that this time would be their last. I can't help but wonder where Charlene thought she might draw the line here. Maybe true love for her didn't have one? How many sexually deviant kidnappings and murders would you stay with your man through, Charlene? That number, for Charlene, would never be established. As the amount of time between Gerald's insatiable cravings got smaller and smaller, it would be 6 brutal slayings later, carried out in the same fashion with Charlene as bait, before Mary Elizabeth's body, the last of Gerald's victims, was discovered in Sacramento. Once again on the run after Gerald was identified by the police to be the Stephen they'd been looking into, the couple would be caught at a Western Union in Omaha, Nebraska, attempting to get cash that Charlene's father had wired to them. Back in Sacramento, charged with Mary and Craig's murders, the pair were separated and Charlene would have her son in the jail's hospital, immediately taken from her and given to the care of her parents. The loss of her son seemed to spark the first conscience in Charlene's heart, and at her next meeting with her lawyers, she'd tell them that she'd been a part of not just 2 murders, but 10. All this information would come out in detail when Charlene struck plea deals with the prosecutors across the United States to testify against her husband, which would reduce her prison sentence to 16 years and 8 months. She was found guilty of all 4 murder charges she was left with and cooperated with police to the extent that she even showed them where the bodies were buried. I guess the main reason behind her lighter sentence, even though she was an accomplice to these horrible acts all the way through. Gerald, on the other hand, would do that sickening thing that serial killers tend to do, and represented himself in court, disposing of his legal team without any deals or even a guilty plea. Charlene would take the stand in his trial, confessing that she was afraid of her husband, but her self-reported motive was love. She loved Gerald Gallego so much that as his wife, she felt a duty to help him carry out his sexual fantasies, even at the cost of 10 bright, young, innocent lives. Even under Gerald's own cross-examination, he struggled to discredit Charlene as a witness, airing all her dirty laundry before the judge finally put a stop to the increasingly petty lovers' quarrel. Gerald would step down to be found guilty on all counts by the jury after 2 hours of deliberation. He was one of the only American criminals to be given the death penalty twice and would wait on death row for 20 years before dying of rectal cancer at the age of 56 in 2002. Charlene was released in 1997 and now refers to herself as another victim of Gerald Gallego, saying, "There were victims that died and victims that lived. It took me a hell of a long time to learn that I was one of the ones who lived." What do you think? How could Charlene go along with all of this for so long, falling asleep on the sofa as Mary Beth's screams of mortal terror echoed through the rest of her and her husband's apartment? While Gerald Gallego seems to be another case of a psychotic serial killer who knows no guilt or shame, I think Charlene is the real mystery of this case. What does love really do to us, and how far would any of us go to save it? When and how do we stop when the person we love is a monster beyond reckoning? Check the comments for more thoughts, and be sure to leave your own. I'm Jason, and this has been a particularly chilling episode of Killer Bites.